My millionaire husband called me sterile in front of everyone in court. His goal, to divorce me and keep his millions. He claimed a clause would leave me with nothing if we divorced. I stayed calm and placed an envelope in the judge's hands. The revelation inside shocked everyone present. My name's Paige Bennett. I'm 32 years old. For 7 years, my life was a picture of success, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows of a Chicago high-rise. From up there, the city looked like a circuit board, all glittering lines and pulsing energy, and I felt like I was floating above it all, untouchable. My husband, Colin Whitaker, was a real estate investor who collected success like art, cool, impressive, and best viewed from a distance. He had a way of standing in a room and making it his, of talking to people and making them feel like they were the only ones who mattered, even as his eyes scanned for someone more important. Our home was his masterpiece: minimalist furniture, white walls, and not a single object out of place. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom, a place where people came to admire Colin's good taste. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, every cushion was perfectly plumped. I remember once leaving a half-finished book on the coffee table, and when I came back an hour later it was gone, tucked away on a shelf in the library as if it had committed a crime by being visible. I matched the decor, poised, supportive, the perfect accessory to his $16.5 million portfolio. I wore the right clothes, said the right things at his dinner parties, and smiled placidly as he told the same stories over and over again. On our mantelpiece, nestled between two starkly modern sculptures, was a single framed photo of us in Italy. We were on a boat in Lake Como, the sun glinting off the water behind us. I was laughing, my head tilted toward him, genuinely happy in that moment. He was smiling too, but it was a smile for the camera, not for me. His eyes, even then, were already looking past me, toward the shore, toward the next thing. That was a motif in our marriage, me looking at him and him looking at the horizon. I told myself the emotional distance was just the price of his ambition. I told myself we were building a future, that the silence in our beautiful, empty apartment was the sound of progress. I was wrong. I wasn't his partner. I was a placeholder, a piece of the perfect picture he was curating. And pictures, I would learn, are easy to replace. It was our 7th anniversary. I'd left my marketing job early, clutching a bottle of champagne we'd been saving since our honeymoon. It was a vintage we'd bought in a tiny vineyard in France, and the plan was to open it on our 10th anniversary, but I felt like we needed a celebration, a reminder of the couple in that photograph. I walked out of the private elevator that opened directly into our foyer, the familiar, sterile scent of clean air and metal greeting me. The apartment was silent, which was unusual. Colin was always on the phone, his voice a low, confident hum that was the constant soundtrack of our lives. I kicked off my heels, the soft click echoing on the polished hardwood floors. I walked toward our bedroom, planning to surprise him. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. I heard a sound, a soft laugh that wasn't mine. It was light, airy, and utterly out of place in the mausoleum we called home. My heart gave a little lurch, a quick, nervous flutter. I pushed the door open and the world didn't just tilt, it fell away from beneath my feet, leaving me in a free fall. There he was, with his assistant, Jenna Miles, a woman half his age with a perpetually starstruck expression and an ambition that was as sharp and obvious as her acrylic nails. They weren't hiding, they weren't frantic. They were casual, lounging on our bed as if I'd just interrupted a coffee break. Jenna was pulling on a stocking and Colin was watching her with a lazy, satisfied smile. The shock was a physical thing. My lungs seized, a vacuum where air should have been. The expensive champagne bottle slipped from my numb fingers. It hit the floor and shattered, a violent explosion of glass and fizzing liquid that sprayed across the wood like a burst artery. The sound was obscene in the silence. He didn't look guilty, he didn't even look surprised. He looked annoyed. That was the first thing that truly broke my heart, not the betrayal but the sheer, unadulterated irritation on his face. "Paige, what are you doing home so early?" he asked, his voice calm, as if I were the one who had broken the rules, as if my presence was an unwelcome intrusion on his schedule. Jenna, his assistant, gathered her things with a practiced smoothness, avoiding my eyes, but I saw it just for a second, a faint smirk playing on her lips. She was enjoying this. She was enjoying my humiliation. My voice was a whisper, a dry rasp that barely made it out of my throat. "It's our anniversary, Colin," he sighed, a theatrical put-upon sound, and ran a hand through his perfect, professionally styled hair. "Look, this isn't how I wanted you to find out." As if there was a right way for me to discover my husband was sleeping with his assistant in our bed on our wedding anniversary, there was no apology, no remorse. Just irritation that his perfect life had been disrupted by something as messy as my feelings. He told me it had been going on for months. He said he was unhappy, that I was too focused on my career, that I didn't understand the pressure he was under. Every word was a perfectly crafted stone, and he was building a wall between us right before my eyes. He wasn't trying to fix anything. He wasn't trying to explain. He was just informing me of the new reality. He was already on the other side of that wall, looking back at me as if I were a distant memory. I spent the next 2 weeks in a fog, a ghost haunting the guest room of my own home. I moved through the white, silent spaces like a phantom, while he conducted business as usual from his home office. The only acknowledgement of the chasm that had opened between us was the cold, sterile silence that now filled every room. He made his calls, took his meetings, and went to the gym. I ate meals I couldn't taste and stared out the vast windows at a city that no longer felt like mine. Then the courier arrived. A young man in a crisp uniform stood in our foyer holding a stark white envelope with my name typed on it. He wouldn't meet my eyes, he just handed it over and left. They were divorce papers, filed and ready to go. Colin hadn't even had the decency to tell me himself. He'd outsourced the final, fatal blow, but there was another letter tucked inside on the thick, expensive letterhead of his lawyer, Paul Dwyer, a man I'd met at parties who had a smile like a shark. It was a threat disguised in complicated legal language. It pointed to a specific part of an agreement we'd signed after our wedding. A no-child clause. I remembered signing it, barely glancing at the words, trusting him completely. Now, those words were a weapon aimed at my heart. It stated that if we didn't have a child by year 10 of our marriage, I would walk away with nothing. Zero, not a penny of the life we had supposedly built together. The letter from Paul Dwyer made his intentions chillingly clear. He was going to argue that I was the reason we were childless. He was going to say I was broken. He wasn't just leaving me. He was trying to erase me, to rewrite the last 7 years of my life into a story where I was nothing more than a failed investment. I packed a single suitcase, leaving behind the designer clothes and the expensive jewelry that had felt like a costume for years. I left the high-rise that had never, not for 1 second, felt like a home. My sister Tara Bennett's apartment in Evanston was the opposite of my old life in every conceivable way. It was warm, a little cluttered with books stacked on every surface, and it smelled permanently of coffee and old paper. The walls were covered in mismatched art and photos of her friends, and the whole place felt lived in, loved. She took one look at my pale face and the single suitcase by my side and pulled me into a hug, no questions asked. The strength in her arms was the first solid thing I'd felt in weeks. I moved into her spare room. The mattress was on the floor and the window looked out onto a boring brick wall, but it was the safest I'd felt in years. Tara didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She made me chamomile tea in a chipped mug and just sat with me on the floor while I stared at the wall, the silence between us comfortable and profound. She was the only person who saw me, not Colin Whitaker's wife, just Paige. The first night, I woke up with a jolt, thinking I'd heard the quiet chime of the elevator arriving at our penthouse. It was just the wind rattling the old window frame. I was finally somewhere real, somewhere the air wasn't filtered and the floors creaked when you walked. Tara's unwavering support was the ground beneath my feet when I had nothing else to stand on. Tara was the one who found her for me. Marta King, my new attorney, had an office that was as practical and no-nonsense as she was. It was small, a little messy, with stacks of files threatening to take over her desk. She didn't waste time on sympathy. She put on a pair of reading glasses, read the letter from Colin's lawyer, and her expression turned grim. "He's not just divorcing you, he's trying to bankrupt you emotionally and financially," she said, her voice blunt and direct. There was no sugarcoating. I appreciated that. She explained that the clause was predatory, designed to leave me destitute, but not necessarily illegal. We'd have to prove he acted in bad faith, that he had manipulated me. That felt impossible. How do you prove a lie that was lived for 7 years? I told her the truth. We'd tried for a baby for years. It was a source of quiet, aching pain between us, a shared grief that I thought had bound us together. Now I knew he was just using it, twisting that shared sadness into a weapon against me. Marta asked the hard questions. Did you ever see a fertility specialist together? Are there any medical records? I felt a hot flash of shame creep up my neck. No, I admitted. Colin always said we should wait, that it would happen when the time was right. He said he didn't want to turn it into a medical problem. Now I knew why. He never wanted a solution, he just wanted a problem he could blame on me. Hiring Marta felt like the first breath of fresh air after being held underwater for too long. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this fight. The calls started a few days later, first from close friends, then from acquaintances, then from people I barely knew. The story was always the same, delivered with a cloying, fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Paige, I'm so sorry to hear," they'd begin. "Colin told us you were having a hard time. He said you two just wanted different things." The different things was code, and I learned quickly what it meant. He wanted a family, I wanted a career. He was desperate for a child, I was too selfish, too ambitious. He was painting a picture of me as a cold, barren workaholic who had refused to give him the one thing he truly wanted. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, and people were buying it. I lost friends I'd had for a decade. They didn't call to hear my side, they just chose his money and his narrative over me. My first, naive tactic was to call him, to try and appeal to the man I thought I had married. I thought if he could just hear my voice, he would remember the life we had, the love I thought we shared. He didn't pick up. Instead, an hour later, I got a call from his lawyer, Paul Dwyer. His voice was slick with condescension. He told me to stop harassing his client and to direct all communication through him. He advised me to accept the reality of my situation. My options, he implied, were narrowing with every breath I took. The world I had known was shrinking, its walls closing in, and Colin was the one methodically laying every single brick. It started with a subtle but persistent wave of nausea in the morning, right around the time Tara was grinding coffee beans, a smell I used to love. I blamed it on stress. My life was imploding, of course I felt sick. My stomach was in knots, my head was pounding, and my body was in open rebellion, but the feeling didn't stop. It wasn't just a morning thing anymore. The smell of takeout from the Thai place down the street made my stomach turn. I was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. I'd fall onto the mattress in the spare room and feel like I was sinking into the floor, but I'd wake up feeling just as drained. Tara noticed, of course. She started leaving saltine crackers and a glass of ginger ale by my bed. "You need to eat," she'd say, her eyes full of a concern that I couldn't bring myself to address. One afternoon, I was sitting at her small kitchen table, looking at a calendar, trying to figure out when my last meeting with Marta was. My eyes landed on the date, and a cold dread washed over me, a feeling entirely different from the anxiety about the divorce. I started counting the weeks, my finger tracing the little boxes backwards. It couldn't be, it just couldn't. It wasn't just stress. My body was telling me something else, something terrifying and impossible. There was that brief 1-month separation 4 months ago, a desperate, lonely time when I'd moved in with Tara for the first time, convinced my marriage was over. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. A kind man, a shared moment of comfort when I thought my life was already in ruins. His name was Evan Walker, a friend from college I hadn't seen in years. Evan was a friend from my art history classes, someone I'd lost touch with after graduation. I'd run into him at a cafe during that brief separation from Colin. He had the same kind eyes I remembered, the same easy smile. He was a landscape architect now, and he had dirt under his fingernails and a calmness about him that felt like a balm on my frayed nerves. He'd listened without judgment as I talked in vague terms about how empty my marriage felt. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer advice. He just saw me. I don't think I'd felt truly seen by anyone in years. We had one night together. There was no pretense, no agenda. It wasn't a romance, it was just two people finding a moment of warmth in the cold. A week later, Colin called, his voice full of promises, begging me to come home, swearing he would work on things. And like a fool, I did. I ended it with Evan in a brief, awkward text message. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that I had to try to save my marriage. I thought that night was just a sad, sweet footnote in a painful chapter of my life. Now, sitting in Tara's kitchen, my hand was shaking as I found his number in my phone. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't even know for sure if there was anything to say. I pressed the call button but hung up before it even had a chance to ring. The fear was too great, a suffocating blanket. This secret was a fragile, terrifying thing. It was mine and mine alone. I couldn't drag him into this mess. Not yet, not until I knew. The social pressure was getting worse. Colin was a master at controlling the narrative, at planting seeds of doubt and watching them grow into a forest of lies. I went to a small gallery opening with Tara, a desperate attempt to feel normal for a single evening, to pretend I was still a person who looked at art and drank cheap white wine from a plastic cup. I saw a couple who used to be our friends, Mark and Sarah. Sarah, a woman I once called a friend, looked right through me, her eyes sliding past my face as if I were a ghost. The dismissal was so complete, so cold, it was like a physical blow. Later, I went to the restroom to splash some cold water on my face and I overheard her talking to another woman. Her voice was low, conspiratorial. He said she refused to even see a doctor. Can you imagine? So ambitious. It's just sad, really. He deserves a family. The words were like tiny, sharp cuts. They were turning my private pain, my silent struggle, into public gossip, a pathetic little story to be shared over cocktails. I realized then that Colin's strategy wasn't just about winning in court. It was about total social annihilation. He wanted to leave me with nothing and no one, to make me so toxic that no one would dare stand by me. I left the gallery without saying goodbye, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and a new, terrifying secret. My small bit of progress in hiring a lawyer had just opened me up to a brand new vulnerability, one I had to protect at all costs. Tara was helping me move the last of my boxes from a storage unit Colin had grudgingly allowed me access to for 1 hour. The unit was small and sad, filled with the parts of my life that didn't fit into his perfect, minimalist world. My college textbooks, old photo albums, a box of my favorite sweaters. At the bottom of an old gym bag I hadn't used in years, my fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. It wasn't my phone, it was a burner phone. Sleek and black and anonymous, I knew instantly it was his. He must have used this bag for one of his business trips and forgotten about it. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me, so strong it made me dizzy. This was a mistake. A crack in his perfectly constructed facade. Back at Tara's apartment, I rummaged through a drawer of old chargers until I found one that fit. The phone lit up. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't password protected. Of course it wasn't. He was arrogant. He never thought he'd get caught. The screen was full of notifications, all from one person, Jenna Miles. I opened the message thread and started scrolling, months and months of messages. They weren't just planning meetings, they were planning a life. They talked about a trip to Bali he wanted to take her on once this is all over. They had inside jokes, pet names. He complained about me. He called me cold, detached, a roadblock to his happiness. I saw my life, my marriage through his eyes, and it was a cold, transactional thing he was merely enduring. This wasn't just proof of an affair. This was the first hard, irrefutable proof of his long-term deception. I wasn't just outmatched, I had been systematically, cruelly deceived by the one person I was supposed to trust. I took the phone straight to Marta's office. The city lights blurred through the taxi window as I clutched the phone in my hand like a grenade. Marta didn't gloat, she didn't say, "I told you so." She simply took the phone, her expression becoming as focused as a surgeon's. "This is good," she said, her voice low. "This establishes a pattern of deception that goes far beyond simple infidelity." We spent the next week building a timeline, a meticulous roadmap of his lies. It was painful, gut-wrenching work, like performing an autopsy on my own marriage. We cross-referenced every text message with his credit card statements, which Marta had gotten through a legal request. The pieces clicked together with sickening precision. There was a charge for $1,420 for a luxury hotel in Milwaukee on a weekend. He told me he was at a real estate conference. Texts from Jenna from that same weekend confirmed she was there with him, complete with pictures of the champagne and strawberries he'd had sent to the room. We found ride-sharing receipts to boutique hotels in our own city during his late nights at the office. The affair wasn't a passionate mistake, it was a well-managed project, a second life he ran with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his business deals. With every receipt, every text message, the last vestiges of the man I thought I married burned away. There was no going back. I wasn't defending myself anymore, I was building a case to dismantle him. The most damning piece of evidence wasn't on the phone, though. It was in a dusty folder of old financial documents I'd brought with me from the storage unit. I was looking for old tax returns, anything that might help Marta establish my financial contribution to our marriage. Tucked between some stock portfolio statements was a single sheet of paper. The letterhead was from a prestigious fertility clinic downtown. The doctor's name was one I didn't recognize. It was a letter dated 2 years ago, supposedly summarizing a consultation with me. It stated in cold, clinical terms that due to a chronic medical condition, my chances of conceiving were practically non-existent. My blood ran cold. My hands started to shake so violently I could barely hold the paper. I had never been to that clinic, I had never met that doctor, I had never had that consultation. It was a complete and utter fabrication. A lie he'd created and filed away, a poison pill ready to be used against me at the perfect moment. I called Marta, my voice trembling. She made a call. The clinic confirmed it. They had no patient named Paige Bennett. And the doctor whose name was on the letterhead hadn't worked there in 5 years. The ticking clock of the court date grew louder in my ears. This was no longer a divorce. It was a war, and he had been planning his attack for years. The evidence against Colin was piling up in a neat, horrifying stack on Marta's desk, but so was the sickness inside me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every morning was a battle against my own stomach. One night, I couldn't take the uncertainty. I walked to a 24-hour pharmacy, my face hidden under the hood of Tara's sweatshirt, and bought a pregnancy test. The fluorescent lights of the store felt painfully bright, and I was sure the cashier could see right through me, could see the terror in my eyes. Back in Tara's tiny bathroom, the one with the leaky faucet and the floral wallpaper, I watched the little plastic window, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. 1 minute felt like a lifetime. Then 2 pink lines appeared, sharp, clear, and undeniable. It wasn't relief that washed over me, it wasn't joy. It was a profound, earth-shattering terror that buckled my knees. A baby, I was pregnant. In the middle of a war with my entire life in flames, I was carrying a child. I sank to the cold tile floor, one hand protectively on my flat stomach. This secret, this tiny life, changed everything. It was a truth that could destroy Colin's entire case, blow his claims about my infertility out of the water. But it felt too sacred, too fragile to be used as a weapon in such an ugly fight. This was my child, not a piece of evidence. And in that moment, my fight suddenly had a purpose beyond myself, beyond the money or the condo or my own wounded pride. I made an appointment with an obgyn, Dr. Laura Patel, a woman with a kind face and gentle hands that Tara had recommended. I used my maiden name, Bennett, and paid in cash, a small act of paranoia that felt absolutely necessary. The clinic was quiet and calm, a different universe from the tense, charged atmosphere of Marta's office or the cold silence of my old apartment. Lying on the examination table with the paper crinkling beneath me, I felt completely and utterly alone. This was a moment I had dreamed of for years, but I'd always pictured Colin holding my hand, his face filled with joy. The reality was so starkly different, it felt like a betrayal of that long-held dream. Then Dr. Patel, my new obgyn, turned the monitor toward me. "There it is," she said softly, 12 weeks and a strong heartbeat. On the gray, grainy screen, a tiny, flickering pulse of light. It was the most real thing I had ever seen. All the noise, Colin, the lawyers, the lies, the whispers, it all faded away into a distant hum. There was only that steady, miraculous beat. Dr. Patel gave me a clean bill of health. She confirmed I was perfectly healthy, that there was no medical reason I shouldn't be able to conceive. The forged letter wasn't just a lie, it was a deep, personal violation of my body and my grief. I walked out of that clinic with a grainy ultrasound photo tucked safely in my purse and a steel rod where my spine used to be. That night, I told Tara. We sat on her worn-out sofa and I showed her the ultrasound picture. She stared at it for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. Then she looked at me and we both cried, not tears of sadness but of something more complex. Fear, relief, and a fierce, protective love for the little flicker on that screen. She didn't ask about the father, she just wrapped her arms around me and said, "We'll figure it out, we always do." Her simple, unwavering "we" was the most beautiful word I'd ever heard. I thought about telling Evan. I typed and deleted a dozen different text messages, my thumb hovering over the send button, but I couldn't do it, not yet. His life was simple and good, he built beautiful gardens. He didn't deserve to be dragged into the toxic sludge of my divorce. Colin and his lawyers would tear him apart. They would question his character, they would demand a paternity test, they would turn this precious, private joy into a public spectacle. I couldn't subject my unborn child to that. His or her life would begin with peace, not with conflict. I made an irreversible choice right there on Tara's couch. The pregnancy would remain a secret. I would protect this new life at all costs, even if it meant fighting this battle with one hand tied behind my back. It was a personal cost I was willing to accept. I walked into Marta's office the next day with a new sense of purpose, a calm that settled deep in my bones. I sat across from her desk, the stacks of files a fortress around her. "I have something to tell you," I said, my voice steady, "but it is not for the court." I explained everything. That I was 12 weeks pregnant and that the father was not Colin. I told her it was completely off the table as a piece of evidence. I would not use my child to win my case. Marta looked at me for a long moment, her sharp legal mind clearly processing the strategic implications. She could have argued with me, could have told me it was the silver bullet we needed, but she didn't. Instead, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, respect. "Okay, Paige," she said, her tone softening just a fraction. "That's your call, but you have to understand it makes things harder, much harder." "I know," I replied. "But my goal has changed." It was no longer about a fair settlement. It wasn't about the money or the condo or the life I thought I'd lost. All of that felt small now, insignificant. "I want to take him down with his own lies," I said, my voice clear and cold as ice. "I want him to sit in a courtroom and have every single one of his deceptions exposed. I want the truth on the record. I want total vindication." My goal was no longer a negotiation, it was a reckoning. We weren't just fighting the clause anymore, we were fighting for the truth. The deposition was a windowless room with a long, polished table and a clock that ticked like a metronome, marking out each tiny humiliation. Paul Dwyer's office had the same clean, cold look as Colin's apartment, leather chairs, a vase with fake orchids, the smell of expensive cologne lingering in the air. Colin sat at one end of the table, checking his phone like he was bored at a show. His jaw was loose with the smugness of someone who thinks they've already won. Across from me, the court reporter had a little machine and a pile of paper. There was a camera in the corner recording everything. Marta put a folder of exhibits in front of me, her face unreadable for once, and I felt the whole day become very small. This was the part of divorce where people tried to turn me into a villain on paper. Dwyer started soft, polite, his voice practiced. He asked about my job, my travel, the hours I worked. He knew how to frame ambition as a character flaw. "So while Mr. Whittaker was home planning for a family, you were in meetings, correct, Miss Bennett?" he asked, making it sound like a crime. He pulled at every thread he could find and tried to stitch them into a picture of me as selfish and uncaring. When he brought up the forged doctor's letter, he said it like it was already fact. "Is it true you consulted with this doctor about fertility issues?" he asked, pressing the page across to the court reporter as if the paper could carry the lie into the record on its own. I kept my answers short. I'd rehearsed restraint until it felt like a muscle. I didn't cry, I didn't plead, I said only what was true. "No," I said when he asked about that clinic, "I have never been to that clinic. I have never met that doctor." Marta objected when he tried to pin me into talking about private medical history, but the objection didn't erase the impression he had planted with the question. He was building a narrative with the little pieces of paper and the carefully phrased questions, and the clock kept ticking as if it had nothing to do with the life it was ruining. Colin never once looked at me. He sat with his shoulders square, his expression the same he used at charity events, calm, almost bored, as if this were inconvenient. His indifference was a kind of cruelty. When I stood to leave, I felt the same cold that had been in our apartment the night I found them. The deposition room had taken my words and translated them into something that could be used against me. It was a slow, methodical stripping away of dignity. Walking out, I thought about all the small, private things they'd trivialized, the late reports I'd stayed up to finish, the trips I'd taken for work, the nights I'd been too tired for dinner. They turned them into evidence that I'd chosen my job over a family, which was not the same as saying I'd chosen to be heartless. The whole thing felt like being explained away. A few days later, the campaign turned meaner. First, it was practical. A card declined at the small grocery down the street when I tried to buy bread and milk. I laughed, nervous, and handed over another card, only to see the same message. Back at Tara's, I logged into my accounts on her old laptop and my stomach dropped. The joint accounts were frozen. A terse email from Dwyer said they were being held while the divorce was pending to protect marital assets. It was a polite theft. Colin was taking the financial reins out of my hands. Marta said there were ways to petition the court to access what I needed, but those things take time and money, two things I was running low on. Then came the box from the condo. Tara signed for it because I was shaking too hard to sign my name. Inside, on top of a stack of cookbooks and old magazines, was the picture from the mantelpiece, the one of us in Italy. The glass was spiderwebbed, the edges jagged where someone had smashed it before putting it in the box. It wasn't an accident. It was a message. He could destroy what he wanted without ever touching me. I sat on Tara's kitchen floor with the broken frame in my lap and felt something inside me shift from sorrow to a quiet, dangerous anger. The litany of small cruelties piled up. A late-night text from a woman I barely knew asking why I wasn't answering her calls. A terse email from Colin's assistant to his business contacts asking them to respect his privacy and implying I was the problem. Marta's office called to say someone had served a notice freezing other assets. It was not just about money, it was about control. He wanted me to be unable to fight back, unable to pay my lawyer, unable to live. He wanted me small and manageable and grateful for whatever crumbs he threw my way. I clung to the idea that not everyone had bought his story. Chloe was the last friend who hadn't gone radio silent. She'd texted me occasionally asking if I needed anything, suggesting lunch dates that never happened when our schedules clashed. When we finally met, it was in a corner booth of a crowded cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and syrup. The noise should have comforted me. Instead, the hum of other lives felt like an accusation. Chloe stirred her coffee in nervous circles, her fingers hovering over her phone. She looked tired in a way I recognized. Marriages do business favors. That's a small, bitter truth. Paige, she said, finally not making eye contact. I think you should take the offer, just take whatever settlement he's offering and be done with it. This isn't worth the public circus. She said it as if she were giving me advice about letting a bad landlord repaint the apartment. Her voice had that clipped, apologetic tone people use when they're trying not to hurt someone they still want to do business with. I asked her quietly why she felt that way. She said her husband's firm did work with Colin's company. I can't be caught on the wrong side of this, she said. I can't afford the fallout. I felt the air go out of the room. It wasn't just that I'd lost a friend, it was that the world had a price tag and people were calculating whether I was worth the cost. Chloe's words hit like a blade. She didn't even look at me when she said it. The polite distance was all business acumen and self-preservation. For a moment I considered begging her to say otherwise, to throw common decency in the trash and stand with me. But I'd learned by then that begging only gives people license to do what they wanted. I breathed slowly, folded the napkin into a small square until my fingers went numb, and said, I understand. It was the most honest thing I could manage. When I left the cafe, the street felt colder, as if even the city had decided it couldn't afford to be on my side. Then Marta called late on a Friday evening. I almost didn't pick up because it was the kind of hour when bad news shows up uninvited, but her tone made me sit up straight. Pack a bag and come in, she said. Now, her voice was quiet but electric, the kind that meant she'd found something she hadn't expected. I caught a cab and watched the city blur past, lights smearing into one another like a watercolor. Marta's office was dim when I arrived. She had a manila folder on her desk, the kind of folder that holds things people would rather not read out loud. She opened it like she was cutting into an old wound. Inside was a single page from a medical record, dated when Colin was 22. The words were plain, clinical, and devastating, a diagnosis that showed he had a 0 sperm count. He'd been told a decade ago that biologically he could not father a child. The sheet had the notes of a specialist, a name of a doctor I didn't recognize, and a hospital stamp. Reading it, my world condensed to that single fact. He had known long before we ever talked about children, long before he'd sat across from me and told me we'd work on it. Marta let me read it twice. The first time I felt nothing but cold. The second time I felt the kinds of things I'd been carrying for months, the betrayal, the lies, the ways he'd twisted our private grief into an excuse to erase me. We sat in silence after that, the kind that holds something powerful and dangerous. We don't reveal this yet, Marta said finally. If we show it now, it's just a document. If we wait until he builds his whole case on you being infertile and then hand this to the judge sealed in an envelope, it will expose every lie he's told. It will make the court see the plan he built to throw you out. The thought of walking into court with that paper in my hand felt like holding a detonator. My chest filled with a new kind of air, hard, clear, urgent. I thought of the maternity tests, the quiet ultrasound in Dr. Patel's office, the tiny heartbeat that made everything else matter. I thought of Tara watching me and of my own voice steadying when I had to speak for myself. Marta had already arranged for the document to be copied, notarized, and placed in a sealed envelope that she would hand to the judge at the precise moment. We planned it like a surgical strike. There would be no leaks, no publicity, no cheap theatrics. It would be a quiet, undeniable truth presented at the moment when it could do the most damage to the false story Colin had built. I left Marta's office that night with the weight of something dangerous settled under my ribs. For the first time in months, I slept without waking every hour to check my phone. The plan was set. We were moving from defense to attack. I thought about the look on Colin's face when he realized the one thing he had thought he could control, the narrative about why we didn't have children, was the very thing that would ruin him. The idea gave me a strange, steady comfort. My hands cradled the small hollow of my belly as if it were a compass, and I fell asleep thinking about the morning the truth would finally be too heavy for him to carry. When Marta slid that single page across her desk, everything I'd been holding loosely in my hands finally snapped into a shape I could no longer ignore. Pieces I'd been fitting together in my head, his late nights, the trips he'd called work, the way he'd always deflected when I suggested seeing someone about our trouble, locked into place like a puzzle completed. It wasn't just a bitter instinct or a hunch anymore. It was proof that every private conversation about children had been a performance he directed so he could later blame me. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. The forged clinic letter, the burner phone, the hotel receipts, they stopped being singular, ugly things and became parts of a plan. He'd created a problem he could point to and say, "See, this is why we must separate." He'd married me, lived with me for 7 years, and used our shared grief as the wedge to justify kicking me out when it suited him. The coldest part wasn't that he cheated. It was that he had built a legal and social scaffolding to erase me while pretending he was the injured party. Marta's voice was steady when she laid it out. If he had this diagnosis before you married and he hid it, then he knowingly set a trap. She tapped the file as if pinning down the story. It's premeditated. Hearing her say the word changed something in me. This was not a messy, heartbroken split with blame on both sides. This was calculated. He'd crafted a narrative and then handed it to everyone who mattered. Friends, colleagues, a man who wrote legal letters for a living. It was cruel in a way that was almost surgical. We decided to let him build the house of cards. Marta argued we had the greatest leverage if we waited until the courtroom, until he had painted me as the woman who wouldn't make him a family. Then, when he had committed to that lie in front of a judge, we'd hand over the medical file and show the judge the truth all at once. It felt risky, like keeping a loaded gun in a drawer and counting the nights until you had to use it, but it was the only way to turn his strategy against him. If we revealed the record too soon, he would pivot, deny, and bury it in another pile of his carefully chosen facts. If we waited, his whole case would rest on the lie. I thought about how many small things had been used to build that lie. The times he'd asked me to put off doctor's visits, the way he'd laugh lightly whenever the subject came up, as if the discomfort belonged to me. I thought of the way he'd whispered promises during our last good week, promising to focus and work on us, while the evidence showed he was laying a foundation for my ruin. Holding that truth in my hand felt both powerful and poisonous. It was vindication waiting to happen and a promise of a reckoning. Marta had the record copied, notarized, and sealed. She said the envelope would be untouchable until the exact moment. She made me promise I wouldn't blurt. "When you hand that to Judge Fox," she said, "it won't just be a file. It'll be a confession." I slept with a tightness in my chest that night, equal parts fear and a fierce, urgent calm. The day before court felt oddly domestic. Tara and I went through rituals to keep my hands steady. She rifled through my closet like a stylist who also doubled as a sister, pulling out a dark blue dress she'd always liked on me. It was simple, no loud patterns, nothing flashy, just a sober, strong shape that felt like armor. She called it that when she handed it to me, "Your armor." We laughed because laughter is a good deflection, and then we cried because crying unfiltered is also necessary sometimes. Tara helped me lay out a small bag with essentials. A bottle of water, a spare pair of shoes, a neatly folded scarf, and the tiny ultrasound print tucked into an inner pocket of my bag like a secret talisman. We made sure my phone was charged, that Marta had copies of everything, and that my hearing aids, my grandmother's old ones, were in case stress made me lose my balance. It was absurd and grounding all at once. That night we talked about the baby in a way that felt like a rehearsal for a different life. We sketched a loose birth plan, not because I thought I could control labor, but because making plans felt like planting a small garden in the middle of a battlefield. We threw out names, quiet names, names that sounded like sunrises, and Tara said she wanted to be with me in the delivery room. The thought of her there steadied me more than I expected. For months, nights had been filled with legal calls and whispered rumors, with me being explained away in closed rooms. Now there were birthdays and lullabies to think of, and that shift made the plan Marta had set feel less like revenge and more like protection. Marta arrived at my apartment late with the sealed envelope cradled like a relic. She'd had it registered, copied, and placed under lock at the firm. She looked tired and ferocious, the kind of exhausted that only comes from nights spent digging for truth. "Tomorrow," she said, "we let him run his story, then we close the book." Her face was a mask I trusted. The sealed paper sat in her briefcase, weighty with more than ink. I couldn't sleep fully that night. I would wake, a small, sharp breath in the dark, feel my hand on my belly and reassure myself that the tiny life inside was safe, that this was the right way, the only way. At 10 that night, Marta forwarded a message that arrived like a brick. Paul Dwyer, with all the smoothness of someone who thinks words can hammer a person into silence, had sent a final offer. The subject line sat in my inbox like an insult. The message itself was condescending and thinly veiled as kindness. He wrote that Colin was prepared to make a one-time payment that would barely touch my legal bills if I would sign a non-disclosure agreement and surrender any claim to our shared assets. Basically, sign this paper and never speak of him again. They wanted to buy my silence for a sum meant to look generous in press statements, but was nothing compared to the life they'd tried to strip from me. The language was designed to make me small. He spoke of Colin's desire to move on and his generosity in handling things privately. There was the old trick of wrapping malice in polite words. For a long minute I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the trash icon. The offer was meant to be the last push, a simple test. Will you take the easy exit and let us ruin you quietly? I felt the old, aching temptation to make it stop. The fatigue, the late nights, the loss of friends, it all pressed in like a physical weight. But then I thought about the ultrasound photo in my purse and the way Tara's hand had gripped mine in the parking lot earlier. I thought of Marta's thin smile that didn't look amused. I thought of the man who had planned my ruin for years. The offer felt like a final, desperate attempt to buy my complicity. Sitting on Tara's couch, the glow from her lamp making circles on the carpet, I felt the old certainty about my life unravel. Was any of it real? The vacations, the small kindnesses, the late-night talks, had they all been part of an elaborate cover? It was an ugly thing to ask yourself, and there was a second uglier question: how had I not seen it sooner? The questions gnawed at me late into the night. I kept replaying small moments, like the time he canceled our anniversary dinner for a work emergency and brushed off my disappointment with a smile. Or the way he said, "We can always decide later," when I suggested seeing a doctor. I had always excused things, telling myself his ambition explained what others might call indifference. Now those excuses felt like thin veils over something darker. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was an erasure of the life we'd shared. There were nights when I felt like a ghost in my own story, watching scenes where I should have been the main character and realizing I'd been a supporting role in someone else's carefully curated life. That sense of being unseen had been with me before he cheated, a quiet undercurrent I never named. But to have it confirmed that my partnership had been built on a lie left me raw. My confidence in my judgment took a hit I didn't expect. How do you trust your senses again after someone you loved rewrites your history? I found myself measuring every memory, weighing the truth of it like a coin in my palm, and each later memory felt colder, thinner. Just when the silence felt like it might swallow me whole, my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't saved. It was Evan. I almost didn't answer because the idea of speaking to anyone felt heavy, but his voice reached through whatever small panic had settled over me and smoothed the edges. "Paige," he said quietly, "I heard some things. I wanted you to know I'm thinking of you." He didn't demand details, he didn't ask prying questions or offer quick fixes, he simply said he was there. His voice was a small, steady thing like a hand on the back of a chair. That simple line, "I'm thinking of you," was a lifeline. Evan's presence reminded me that there were people who saw me for me, not for the curated story Colin sold. He offered practical words too: a meal dropped at Tara's house, a check-in the morning of the trial, someone to sit with Tara in the waiting room. He didn't try to be my savior, he was just present. At one point he said, "You asked me once if I believed you'd get through hard things. I do, I always have." Hearing that in that plain, unadorned way steeled something in me. After we hung up, I deleted Paul Dwyer's message without opening the attachment. The offer would remain an insult that belonged on the floor. I felt the old heaviness lift a little, replaced by a hard, clear determination. Evan's quiet confidence didn't push me into bravado. It simply reminded me that I wasn't as alone as he'd tried to make me feel. I packed the small bag for court one last time, ran my fingers over the sealed envelope in Marta's packet, imagined its weight, and smoothed my dress. The next day would be the reckoning. I wasn't fighting for a headline or revenge for its own sake. I was fighting for the life that was growing inside me and for a truth that deserved to be told. The courthouse smelled like old paper and polish, the kind of smell that settled into your clothes and your lungs and made everything feel louder. My hands were folded in my lap and didn't shake. Tara squeezed my fingers once and then settled back, her face a quiet island of calm. We drove in silence, both of us listening to the city wake up around us, the radio muted. The building's marble steps were cold under my shoes. Men and women in suits moved like they were part of the architecture, purposeful, practiced. When I stepped through the doors, the waiting room felt smaller than it had on TV. Fluorescent lights, a vending machine humming, a bulletin board with lost and found notices. The air hummed with low conversations, people moving their lives through rooms like this one. I spotted Colin across the room as soon as I sat down. He was talking with Paul Dwyer, his posture perfect, the kind of practiced ease I'd been fooled by for years. He looked immaculate, his suit sharp, his tie just so. There was a kind of casual cruelty in the way he glanced at me, like he was checking on a specimen. Jenna was in the second row, hands folded, hair done in a way that made her face look smaller and more eager. The sight of her there made my stomach flip, a small, hot knot that I kept pressing with my thumb until it dulled. When the bailiff called us into the courtroom, the room shifted into a different temperature, colder, tighter. The wooden benches, the panel of masks that was the gallery, the flat light coming through high windows. Marta moved with the kind of steady purpose she had in meetings, precise, sure. She slid the sealed envelope into her briefcase and didn't take her eyes off me, the look on her face saying what her mouth didn't. "You're ready." I took my seat and felt the leather under my thighs, the small, familiar press of Marta's file against my elbow. The judge entered, Judge Irene Fox, the same stern face I'd seen in the local news, sober, unamused by flash or show. The room fell into a hush the way water stills when something heavy is dropped into it. Paul Dwyer rose first. He had that slow, soft voice that made you lean forward without meaning to. He laid out Colin's side like it was a plain, sad story. A man who wanted a family and a wife who chose work instead, who didn't want to have children, who had allegedly been seen avoiding talk of fertility. His words were careful, like someone arranging a delicate sculpture so it wouldn't topple. "Miss Bennett," he said without looking at me, "chose a career path that left little room for family life. The evidence will show she either could not or would not have children with Mr. Whittaker, and the clause they signed years ago was intended to protect Mr. Whittaker's ability to rebuild his life." He wrapped the claim in sympathy, like it was his job to be sad on Colin's behalf. Watching him, I realized how practiced he was at building a story out of scraps and making everyone see his version first. He pointed to little things and turned them into reasons. The nights I worked late, the trips I took for my job, my ambition, which he said with a soft, accusing tone. He lifted the forged letter, the one Colin had planted like it had weight and truth. That was the cruelty of their opening. They were not just telling a story, they were dressing it up, rehearsing it for the judge, for anyone who would listen. Colin sat behind Dwyer, nodding at the right moments, building a picture of himself as the wounded party. The room felt like a stage, and I hated that for a second, the idea that my life, my grief, my private hunger for a child that I had carried in secret for years, could be edited into someone else's neat, profitable story. When it was our turn, Marta spoke quietly but with a force that made the air shift. "Your Honor," she said, "we intend to show that the narrative built by the defense is false and that the plaintiff has acted in bad faith." Her words were not loud, but they were clear, and they landed. She called me to the stand, and the motions of the room narrowed to just me and the judge and whatever truth I could hold steady. I walked slowly, feeling every step like a heartbeat. Up close, the judge's face had lines in it that made her look human, not like the figure on a television screen. I could see her hands folded, the papers on the bench like a barrier that might be moved. Marta asked me to identify the exhibits. One by one, she set them out. The burner phone with Jenna's messages, the hotel receipt from Milwaukee, the ride receipts to boutique hotels, the rideshare confirmations that matched his late nights at the office. With each paper she held up, I felt the room tilt more toward reality. People leaned forward, Colin's shoulders tightened. I gave clear answers. I didn't let my voice wobble. "Yes, that is a message from Jenna Miles on his burner phone," I said. "Yes, that is his credit card charge for the Milwaukee hotel." Marta moved through the facts like a calm surgeon. We weren't telling a story about how I felt, we were showing the tracks he'd left in the world. Then Marta brought out the forged letter she'd found in my old documents and asked the clinic's records keeper to testify. The records keeper, a soft-spoken woman, confirmed the clinic had no record of me under that doctor and that the doctor had not been at the clinic when that letter was dated. I watched the color drain from Colin's face. Marta's hands didn't shake when she asked, "Did Mr. Whitaker have any right to produce this as evidence?" The answer came back, slow and clear, "No, not without proof it was genuine." The judge's eyes sharpened. I felt that tiny, satisfying itch of being believed in a room where I had been disbelieved for months. The whole room drew a breath when Marta said, "Your Honor, we have additional material that answers the central claim the defense is making." She made no fanfare as she reached into her briefcase and set the sealed envelope on the bench in front of Judge Fox. For a second, the sound of the room was the circulating air, the scribble of a court reporter, and my own pulse in my ears. Paul Dwyer stood as if to object, his face white behind polite calm. He tried to say it was improper, a last-minute surprise, but Judge Fox, a woman who had clearly heard a lot of spin in this room, cut him off with a look that told him to sit down. Marta's voice was steady when she said, "This envelope contains a medical record from a treating physician dated 10 years ago pertaining to Mr. Whitaker. We submit it now because the plaintiff's entire argument hinges on my client's supposed inability to conceive, which is being used to justify this punitive clause." She gestured toward me, small and steady. Judge Fox took the envelope like it was an important, delicate thing. Her fingers tore the seal with purpose. She read with the same plain face she carried into the room. Paper moved, her eyes tracked lines. I watched the slow adjustment of a person forced to confront a fact she hadn't known before. There was a moment, less than a minute, where she read and then read again. Her mouth made no sound, but her face shifted. It was a look I had wanted to see for months, that flash of recognition, the sudden understanding when the truth arrives. She looked up and her gaze traveled like a beam, landing on Colin. For the first time since that awful day in our bedroom, I saw him small. The confident mask slipped. He had the look of a man who'd miscounted his chess pieces and realized his king was naked. The room hummed. You could hear the clock. Jenna in the back row looked as if she might run. Her hands found each other, fingers twisting with something like fear. Judge Fox set the paper down and addressed the courtroom with a voice that had an edge of coldness I will never forget. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "this document calls into question the basis of your claim." She paused, letting it land. She told the court she would take a short recess to review the document more carefully. The hush that followed was different from that earlier stillness. It was a loaded silence, heavy with consequence. Marta sat back, never taking her eyes off the judge. I felt a release move through my body like a tide. For months I'd braced for vindication, now it might come. When Judge Fox returned from the brief recess, the courtroom felt altered. The judge didn't raise her voice, but each word was hard as stone. This court finds that there has been a deliberate attempt to mislead this court and to use false documents to prejudice one party against another, she said. She described plainly what the sealed record showed. That Colin had been diagnosed when he was young with a condition that left him unable to produce sperm. She said the document in our exhibits was a medical record that contradicted the defense's central claim. She looked at Colin and said, based on the evidence presented, the postnuptial clause relied upon by the plaintiff is void as it was procured through fraud and misrepresentation. She went on to a swift judgment. The condo would be awarded to me, along with a majority of shared assets, and she ordered support for a limited term of years to help me rebuild. Then, with a firmness that felt like the end of a long, heavy nightmare, she announced she would refer the matter of the forged documents to the proper authorities for investigation. Colin's lawyer sputtered, tried to object, tried to say it was all a misunderstanding, but Judge Fox had the last word. In the back of the room, Jenna stood, her face a pale shell. She rose, gathered her purse, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the press would come with flashing cameras and questions, but inside that room, the long work of truth had been done in a single, quiet move. When the gavel finally came down, it sounded like a release. I felt it in my bones more than my ears. Tara reached across and squeezed my hand so hard I thought it might hurt, but I welcomed the sting. Marta leaned in and whispered, "You did it," as if I hadn't done the work. I allowed myself to breathe, to let the chest tightness ease a fraction. The verdict was decisive, and the relief, when it came, washed over me like warm water after a long, cold night. The press outside the courthouse was a chaotic blur, flashing cameras, shouted questions, phone lights like small stars. Reporters clustered at the podium, voices folding into each other. "Paige, what do you have to say about the verdict?" Someone called. "Will you press charges?" Another shouted. For a second the noise seemed like a physical thing pushing inward. I kept my head down and walked. Marta was at my side, steady as a rock. Tara hovered near the car, waiting with that fierce look sisters have when they mean business. I didn't answer. I didn't want my voice turned into another headline or a clever soundbite. My silence felt like armor. I caught sight of Colin as we moved through the crowd. He'd been hustled out a side door, shielded by his attorney and a pair of men who looked like they'd been hired for the moment. His face was tight with fury and something else, humiliation. There was no sympathy in his eyes now, only calculation as he tried to figure how this would look to his clients and friends. Jenna had left earlier, already gone, probably realizing the life she'd been promised was built on a lie. Seeing him small, hurried, not in control, that was a quiet pleasure I let myself feel for maybe 2 heartbeats. Tara wrapped me in a hug when we reached the car. She smelled like coffee and the sugar of the scones she'd bought that morning. Her arms were warm and fierce, and for the first time in months the knot in my chest loosened a little. "You did it," she said into my hair, and I let myself believe it. The crowd wanted sound, a line they could run across the evening news. I had no script for them. I stepped into the car with Marta and Tara and let them field what they needed to. My silence spoke louder than anything I could have said. The truth had been told where it mattered. Outside, words would scatter and be reshaped. Inside that courtroom, it was done. We didn't go back to Tara's. Marta had arranged a locksmith to meet us at the high-rise, and I wanted those new keys like someone who'd finally agreed to take a house that had been mine by right. The locksmith was early, a pleasant man with quick hands and a toolbox that smelled faintly of grease. He worked with the efficient, unobtrusive rhythm of someone who's used to erasing another person's access. When he handed me the new set of keys, they felt heavier than they'd looked in the catalog. They were simple brass, cool and real in my palm. For a moment I held them like a talisman. Walking into the apartment was strange. Everything looked exactly as it had the night I left, the white walls, the minimalist lamps, the photo on the mantel still in its box. But I moved through it with different eyes. This time I noticed the way the sunlight pooled on the hardwood floor in the late afternoon, the soft sound of traffic below, the faint hum of the refrigerator that suddenly felt like a companion rather than an intrusion. I opened the windows and let the city air in, which smelled of rain on hot concrete and something green from a neighbor's plant. The apartment felt less like a showroom now and more like the place where I would make a life again. My laptop sat on the kitchen counter and I checked my inbox out of habit. There was a new message from Marta. Attached was a file from a copy shop, a time-stamped receipt showing that Colin had altered the page of our postnuptial agreement with the no-child clause 8 months after we'd signed it. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final proof that everything had been engineered. I forwarded it to Marta with a short note. For the record, I didn't want to gloat, I wanted the record clean and complete. The knowledge that the full truth was in safe hands felt like closing a wound with steady stitches. I walked through the rooms, touching surfaces where my hands remembered the small things, where a mug had sat, where a paperback had been left open. I moved a lamp an inch to the left, a tiny act that felt like reclaiming territory. In the bedroom, I found the empty space where the shattered picture frame had been. I brought out a small plant Tara had given me and set it on the mantel, a stubborn green promise. Life goes on. My hand rested on my belly without thinking. The tiny life inside me had been my secret armor through all of it, and here, in the quiet of my own home, it felt safe for the first time. That night I cooked a simple meal, store-bought pasta and a jarred sauce, nothing fancy, and Tara joined me. We sat at the kitchen counter and talked about practical things. Changing the locks permanently, schedules for doctor visits, who would be the person to call if I went into labor. We didn't speak much about court. We didn't need to. The big act had been done. The rest was rebuilding. Choosing paint, ordering a crib, picking a pediatrician. It all felt so ordinary and so profound. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to fight for your truth, I'd be honored to read your story in the comments below. Please subscribe for more.